I'm making this video about the wild beast in the book of Revelation, and more specifically about the 10 horns or 10 kings of that same wild beast. I hope to overturn the popular conviction that the kings are pagan kings, presidents, or prime ministers. And if you carefully follow along and persevere in this video, I think I can overturn that conviction and show you that those kings or horns are in fact anointed kings. This video is a supplement to another video series I made about the book of Revelation, and it will have some very deep insights throughout many supporting scriptures in both the Old Testament and the New Testament. So first of all, we'll go to the book of Revelation in chapter 17 and look at the scripture which describes that wild beast with the 10 horns. And here it is in Revelation chapter 17 and verse 3. It says, "And he carried me away in the power of the Spirit into a wilderness, and I caught sight of a woman sitting upon a scarlet-colored wild beast that was full of blasphemous names, and that had 7 heads and 10 horns." And so in this video, I hope to give some insight into who these 10 horns are. I'll make a video later on about the 7 heads. And so I won't be discussing the 7 heads in this video. If we continue through this chapter 17, then it mentions those 10 horns once again. And we'll find in verse 12 that those 10 horns that you saw mean 10 kings who have not yet received a kingdom, but do receive authority as kings 1 hour with the wild beast. And these have one thought, and so they give their power and authority to the wild beast. These battle with the Lamb, Jesus Christ, but because he is Lord of lords and King of kings, the Lamb will conquer them. Also, those called and chosen and faithful with him will do so. And so this is very significant. It indicates that there will be called, chosen, and faithful people who will battle against these 10 kings and the wild beast with Jesus Christ. And in my opinion, these called and chosen and faithful ones will therefore understand who these 10 kings are. And so it's very important, if you believe you are a called, chosen, and faithful Christian, that you know who these 10 kings are. Because if you are battling with these 10 kings, then you ought to know who your enemy is. And this scripture implies that there will be people who do understand. So many Christians speak about faith and being faithful, and yet have not made that connection in the scripture, that being faithful would mean that you would battle 10 kings. So are you a Christian and you don't know who these 10 kings are, or have any indication what this scripture might mean? Well, if you are, then I strongly suggest that you persevere through this video. Now, in order to research some more information about these 10 kings, it's a good idea to go back to Daniel chapter 7, where a wild beast with 10 kings is first mentioned. And so if we go to Daniel chapter 7, we'll find that this is a dream with visions that Daniel had, and he perceived in this dream several wild beasts. The first one like a lion, the second one like a bear, third one like a leopard, and then the fourth and final one that is fearsome and terrible and unusually strong. And so it's this fourth and final one that makes an appearance in the final part of the days, in the final part of the denunciation. And so this fourth and final one is the beast that has 10 horns. So let's read this scripture. In Daniel 7 verse 7, it says, "After this I kept on beholding in the visions of the night, and see there a fourth beast, fearsome and terrible and unusually strong. And it had teeth of iron, big ones. It was devouring and crushing, and what was left, it was treading down with its feet." And it was something different from all the other beasts that were prior to it. And it had 10 horns. I kept on considering the horns, and look, another horn, a small one, came up in among them. And there were 3 of the first horns that were plucked up from before it. And look, there were eyes like the eyes of a man in this horn, and there was a mouth speaking grandiose things. And so this description of the fourth fearsome and terrible wild beast contains many adjectives that I would like my audience to focus on, because these adjectives will connect to another scripture later on, which will help you see that the wild beast is not a pagan institution and the kings are not pagan kings. And so carefully examine these adjectives and the nouns like fearsome, terrible, unusually strong, teeth, devouring, crushing, treading down, and we'll later on match those adjectives and nouns to another scripture which shows us who those 10 kings are. Now, later on, when the angel helped Daniel understand the vision that he was seeing, it makes another mention of this fourth wild beast. And here it says that Daniel wanted to make certain concerning that fourth beast, which was different from all the others. And so we'll find more adjectives and nouns in this scripture. So carefully focus on these adjectives and nouns. Extraordinarily fearsome, the teeth of which were of iron, the claws of which were of copper. It was devouring and crushing and treading down what was left with its feet. And then it once again mentions the 10 horns that were on its head, and another horn that came up, before which 3 fell, and even that horn that had eyes and a mouth speaking grandiose things, and the appearance of which was bigger than that of its fellows. I kept on beholding when that very horn made war upon the holy ones. And so remember, in Revelation chapter 17, it mentioned the Lord of Lords would battle with the horns, and the faithful, the called, chosen, and faithful ones would also battle. So here's some more important connections to that wild beast in Revelation. It mentions here it was prevailing against them, and so this battle will not be an easy battle. At the end of this battle, the Ancient of Days came, and judgment itself was given in favor of the holy ones. And the definite time arrived that the holy ones took possession of the kingdom itself. Now, this is an important scripture because it indicates that the holy ones do not possess this kingdom. So who possesses the kingdom? This fourth fearsome wild beast and the 10 kings possess the kingdom. The holy ones do not yet possess that kingdom. Very important to consider this. And so now what I'd like to do is go to another scripture in the New Testament and make that connection with all those nouns and adjectives which describe the final wild beast. So here we are in the Old Testament, and we'll jump to the book of Micah and chapter 3. Now, remember those nouns and adjectives describing the wild beast in Daniel chapter 7 as I read the first several verses of Micah chapter 3. So here we go. And I proceeded to say, "Hear, please, you heads of Jacob." Very important. This scripture is addressing the heads of Jacob. "And you commanders of the house of Israel." Commanders? Could they be kings? Heads of Jacob? Well, the heads of Jacob are the 12 sons, the leaders of the 12 tribes of Jacob. So this is who it is addressing. But is it addressing the ancient 12 tribes? Or is this an end-time scripture which is closely related to that wild beast in the book of Revelation? Listen carefully to those nouns and adjectives in this scripture. "Is it not your business to know justice, you haters of what is good and lovers of badness?" Tearing. Here's an adjective. Tearing off their skin from people and their organism from off their bones. Now that sounds like a very fearsome and terrible thing to do. On to verse 3. "You, the ones who have also eaten the organism of my people and have stripped their very skin from off them and smashed to pieces their very bones and crushed them to pieces like what is in a wide-mouthed pot and like flesh in the midst of a cooking pot. At that time they will call to Jehovah for aid, but he will not answer them, and he will conceal his face from them in that time, according as they committed badness in their dealings." And so these nouns and adjectives that we've just read in this scripture in Micah chapter 3 describe the badness of the dealings of the heads of Jacob and commanders of the house of Israel in that time. So later on I'm going to make a connection to what time that is. What time is this scripture talking about? Is it talking about the end times, just like in Revelation, the wild beast in Revelation? If we continue through Micah, we'll find out that it is indeed an end time scripture. So now let's go on, and we'll find a few more nouns and adjectives in verse 5. "This is what Jehovah has said against the prophets that are causing my people to wander, that are biting with their teeth, and that actually call out peace, that when anyone does not put something into their mouths, also sanctify war against him." And so what I will do now is open a window on that scripture in Daniel 7 and leave this window in Micah 3 open so we can flip back and forth and examine and discuss those nouns and adjectives that are so similar, profoundly similar in the two scriptures. So here we go to Daniel chapter 7, and we should be able to easily flip back and forth now and examine those nouns and adjectives and discuss them. So here we are back in Daniel 7, looking at those adjectives and nouns describing the fourth beast, fearsome and terrible and unusually strong. Now, this scripture is using beasts as a metaphor for an organization. In fact, it's for a kingdom. The wild beast represents a kingdom, and I hope that by the time I reach the end of this video, that my audience will understand that that kingdom is Jesus Christ's kingdom, Christianity. So now let's go and look at the adjectives and nouns. This wild beast has teeth of iron, big ones. And so if you have a wild beast with teeth of irons, big ones, then what is the fear that it gives to you? Because after all, this is fearsome. The fear is that these teeth of iron would eat you, which is what devouring means. Devouring and eating, same thing. So now let's flip back to Micah and notice that in Micah it says that you, the ones who have also eaten the organism of my people. So if this is an end time scripture, my people are Christians. And so make that connection between devouring and eaten the organism. Same thing. And with those big, strong teeth, remember those teeth in Daniel? It mentions that are biting with their teeth. And so these are metaphors not for literally biting with teeth, but for the end result, the badness in their dealings. So the badness of the dealings of the heads of Jacob is being described as biting with their teeth. And so if you're afraid or of a fearsome wild beast, which we probably ought to be, that has teeth of iron, big ones, we're afraid that it's going to eat something. And notice also that it's crushing and treading down with its feet. So remember this adjective, crushing and treading down, in Daniel chapter 7. And we'll go back to Micah. And what is happening in Micah? It is smashing to pieces their very bones, crushing them to pieces. Like what is in a wide-mouthed pot, and like flesh in the midst of a cooking pot. So crushed to pieces, smashed to pieces. It's the same metaphors being used in this scripture in Daniel chapter 7, where the wild beast is eating or devouring and crushing and treading down, smashing to pieces with its feet. And in fact, if it's a big wild beast like an elephant, isn't that what we're afraid of? Being stepped on and crushed? So let's go further down and look at some more of the adjectives mentioned when Daniel wanted to know more about the fourth wild beast. He desired to make certain concerning that fourth wild beast, and so should we. It was extraordinarily fearsome, the teeth of which were of iron. So, already mentioned that the scary part about big teeth of iron is that it might eat something. Now notice that it mentions the claws of which were of copper. And so if a person encounters a wild beast in the forest, like a huge bear or a mountain lion that have claws, then what is that person afraid of that the wild beast might do with its claws if they encountered it? Well, a wild beast with claws which are of copper can very easily strip and tear your skin when it grabs a hold of you with those claws. And so this is a metaphor which is profoundly paralleled in Micah chapter 3. So let's go back to Micah chapter 3. And if you encounter a wild beast with claws of copper, what are you afraid that it might do? You're afraid that it might strip their very skin from off them and tear off their skin from people. And so the end result of a wild beast with claws is that if it uses those claws, it will tear off your skin and strip off your skin. And so if a person encounters a bear in the forest, that is the very thing that you should be afraid of, is that bear will strip your skin off with those huge claws. And so I'm hoping that my audience recognizes the parallels, and that Micah chapter 3 is indeed talking about that fearsome wild beast in Daniel chapter 7. Now, I'm using the New World Translation of the Holy Scriptures to make the comparison with these nouns and adjectives, but I recommend that my audience looks them up through several different translations in order to make the same comparison I'm making here with the New World Translation. And convince yourself that Micah chapter 3 is talking about the exact same wild beast that's biting with their teeth, those teeth of iron, and eating or devouring with those teeth. And so all these are metaphors being used to describe what the heads of Jacob, the 12 leaders of the 12 tribes of Israel, or kings, are doing in regard to the extent of the badness that they commit in their dealings. And so all these are metaphors to describe how the heads of Jacob execute their justice. Their justice is being compared to all these metaphors of a very fearsome and terrible wild beast in regard to their dealings. And so the final part of the kingdom will have no justice. Their dealings will be bad. They will be completely lawless. So now it's a good idea to read the rest of Micah chapter 3, and I'll let you do that. But what's the end result of all this badness in their dealings? And if you go to the end of Micah chapter 3, we hear what happens to the sons of Jacob. And this once again addresses the head ones of the house of Jacob. And so if we're talking about head ones from the house of Jacob, these are the 12 leaders of the tribes of Israel. Kings. They are kings. 12 kings. And yet, remember that this wild beast has only 10 kings. And so the question this raises is whether all of these 12 leaders of the tribes of Israel are ones who detest justice. It suggests that perhaps there are 2 leaders of the house of Jacob, or tribes of Israel, who are indeed standing before the Lord and who understand justice and are executing that justice. And in fact, if we back up to verse 8, it says, "And on the other hand, I myself have become full of power with the Spirit of Jehovah, and of justice and mightiness, in order to tell to Jacob his revolt, and to Israel his sin." And so in the middle of this chapter, there is a small respite from all of this unrighteousness described in regard to the house of Jacob. And so the end result of all of this, well, these head ones of the house of Jacob are the ones who are building Zion or God's kingdom, with acts of bloodshed, and they're building Jerusalem with unrighteousness. And so this house of Jacob is the leaders responsible for building God's kingdom, and is described as Jerusalem and Zion. And the end result, these people believe that God is in fact for them, and they believe there will come upon them no calamity. So they're well aware of the end time calamity that is approaching, and that they will escape this end time denunciation. But the final result is, therefore, on account of you men, the heads of Jacob, those 10 leaders of the house of Jacob, Zion will be plowed up as a mere field, and Jerusalem herself will become heaps of ruins, and the mountain of the house will be as the high places of a forest. And so the kingdom that the house of Jacob are building will be plowed up and destroyed. Jerusalem herself will become heaps of ruins. What I would like to do now is skip ahead to Micah chapter 4 and see what it says in the next verse. It will help us understand what time we're talking about. Remember, we're talking about a time, that time. What is that time? Well, let's skip ahead to Micah chapter 4 and see what it says. In Micah chapter 4, the very first thing it says, in verse 1, and it must occur in the final part of the days that the mountain of the house of Jehovah will become firmly established above the top of the mountains, and it will certainly be lifted up above the hills, and to it peoples must stream. And so here, immediately after describing the denunciation upon Zion and Jerusalem, it then immediately describes what will happen in the final part of the days. This is a very important connection to make, that Zion will be plowed up and destroyed, and then during that same time, in the final part of the days, it will be established, firmly established, above the top of the mountains. And so now what I'd like to do, now that we understand that this is indeed an end-time circumstance, an end-time scripture, it is talking about that wild beast in the book of Revelation and what happens immediately after that wild beast is destroyed. And so if you compare this to Revelation, after the wild beast is destroyed in the book of Revelation, God's kingdom, or his temple and Jerusalem, is firmly established above the top of the mountains. And I strongly recommend that you read the book of Revelation and understand that there is a plowing up of Zion and Jerusalem, and then it's firmly established. Now, some people might think, well, hold on, isn't this talking about Judaism? Literal Jews building Zion and Jerusalem? Well, if you're a Christian who believes that this scripture is talking about Jews building or rebuilding Zion and Jerusalem, then I'd like to take you to what the apostles thought in the New Testament, in the book of Acts, and we'll go to chapter 15. And here the apostles came to an understanding that they were indeed rebuilding Jerusalem. If we go to verse 13, here we have the apostles discussing situations amongst themselves in the first century. And in verse 13 it says, "After they quit speaking, James answered, saying, Men, brothers, hear me. Simeon," or this is Peter, Simon Peter, "has related thoroughly how God for the first time turned his attention to the nations." And so we're no longer talking about Jews here. He's talking about Gentiles. "To take out of them a people for his name," Jehovah. "And with this the words of the prophets agree, just as it is written." And this is what it says in Amos, the last chapter of Amos. It says, "After these things I shall return and rebuild the booth of David that is fallen down." And so the booth of David, Jerusalem. He is talking about Gentiles, Christians, rebuilding Jerusalem. "And I shall rebuild its ruins and erect it again, in order that those who remain of the men may earnestly seek Jehovah together with people of all nations." Gentiles, Christians. It's no longer talking about Jews rebuilding Jerusalem. It's talking about Gentiles rebuilding the booth of David. "People who are called by my name, says Jehovah, who is doing these things from of old." And so now, if you are a Christian convinced that when Micah is talking about Jerusalem and Zion, that it must be in reference to only Jews and Israel, then please understand that in the final part of the days, Zion is being built by people of the nations, people called by my name, says Jehovah. So building Zion with acts of bloodshed and Jerusalem with unrighteousness does not have to mean that this house of Jacob contains Jewish leaders of the tribe of Israel. Because Zion, or the booth of David, and Jerusalem is being built by people of the nations. And so if this is an end-time scripture, which is strongly suggested by what it says in the next chapter, Micah chapter 4, and it must occur in the final part of the days, that the mountain of the house of Jehovah will become firmly established, then this is about Christianity, not Judaism. This might be a difficult concept for many people to understand, but hopefully what I've described in Acts chapter 15, you might be convinced. Okay, so now let's go back to Daniel chapter 7 and make the connection. Here we have the mountain of the house of Jehovah firmly established in the final part of the days. Immediately after, Zion is plowed up as a mere field, and Jerusalem herself is heaps of ruins. And so these heads of Jacob, the head ones of the house of Jacob, are ruling the kingdom, Jesus Christ's kingdom. And if my audience has now properly made the connection between all these adjectives and nouns to that wild beast in Daniel chapter 7, then we can go back and understand further what Daniel chapter 7 is helping us to discern. So here we are now back in Daniel chapter 7, and we'll notice that after describing this fearsome fourth beast, that Daniel discerns that that horn made war upon the holy ones. And so These 10 kings, the sons of Jacob, who should be holy, they, in fact, the leaders of the tribes of Israel, are indeed called chosen anointed ones, and yet they're making war upon the holy ones. Now, if you understand that there should be 12 leaders of the tribes of Israel, the sons of Jacob, and this beast has 10 horns, then it appears that those 10 horns, 10 of the leaders of the tribes of Israel, are battling against the remaining 2. This is key, important to understand in regards to end-time scriptures. So this battle is between the sons of Jacob, the ones who do not know justice, and the ones who do, the holy ones. And notice that it's the holy ones who took possession of the kingdom itself. So understanding this battle, this war upon the holy ones, that this battle is for possession of the kingdom. Yet these 10 kings will prevail against the holy ones. And so the 10 kings who are building Jerusalem with acts of bloodshed and unrighteousness and injustices, using all those metaphors describing the wild beast, will have possession of the kingdom, and the holy ones will not have possession until the very end. And if we continue in Daniel chapter 7, we'll see that's exactly what happens. It describes these 10 kings that rise up, and that they intend to change times and law, and that in the final part of the days the court proceeds to sit, and his own rulership they finally take away in order to annihilate him and to destroy him totally. And so if we've discerned that this wild beast is in fact being ruled by the sons of Jacob, who do not understand justice, that kingdom will be taken away from them and given to the holy ones. And that's exactly what it says in verse 27. The kingdom and the rulership and the grandeur of the kingdoms and under all the heavens were given to the people who are the holy ones of the Supreme One. Their kingdom is an indefinitely lasting kingdom, and all the rulerships will serve even then. And so this is the final part of the days. The mountain of the house of Jehovah will become firmly established. Their kingdom is an indefinitely lasting kingdom. So if you're a Christian who might be understanding these things and looking at Christianity immediately before the return of Jesus Christ, then Christianity has become a kingdom being ruled by leaders who do not understand justice. They are crushing and tearing and biting in regards to their dealings. Now notice in Daniel chapter 7 that the demise of this wild beast, the heads of Jacob, those 10 kings, is determined by a court that proceeded to sit. And they took away the rulership from these heads of Jacob. Now that we've made that connection to the wild beast in Daniel, which has 10 kings, the wild beast in the book of Revelation, which also has 10 kings, and now we've made the very profound connection with those parallel nouns and adjectives used in Micah chapter 3 to the heads of Jacob, we can confidently say that it's this rulership that is finally taken away. So these are real leaders of the tribes of Israel in the final part of the days. But remember, it doesn't mean that they are Jewish, literally Jewish, because Jerusalem, or the Booth of David, is being rebuilt by Gentile Christians, as the apostles came to understand in Acts chapter 15. And so this court is the court that makes the final determination to annihilate the wild beast, that terrible, fearsome situation that's due to the leaders, the heads of Jacob, who are the 10 kings. Now, if we go back through Daniel chapter 7, closer to the start, we'll notice it mentions that court again. I kept on beholding until there were thrones placed, and the Ancient of Days sat down. His clothing was white as snow, hair of his head was like clean wool. So it's talking about Jesus Christ. There was a stream of fire flowing and going out from before him. And 1,000 thousands kept ministering to him, and 10,000 times 10,000 that kept standing before him. The court took its seat, and there were books that were opened. Now you could go to Revelation chapter 20, and you'll also notice that there are books or scrolls opened in Revelation chapter 20, and the judgments occur through those scrolls. And this, I believe, is the same kind of judgment that happens exactly as foretold in the book of Revelation. So I strongly recommend that you read that chapter 20 to see the parallels. Now, notice that these 1,000 thousands and 10,000 times 10,000 are angelic beings ministering to Jesus Christ. And so how does Jesus Christ administer the justice that occurs through this court? Well, we can find out from something that Jesus Christ himself said in Matthew chapter 13. And so if we go to Matthew chapter 13, he tells us what happens in the final part of the days, the conclusion of the system of things. And this happens when he explains to his disciples the illustration of the weeds in the field. And this is Jesus Christ explaining what will happen in the conclusion of the system of things. So in verse 40, Matthew chapter 13, Jesus Christ says, "Therefore, just as the weeds are collected and burned with fire, so it will be in the conclusion of the system of things. The Son of Man, Jesus Christ, will send forth his angels." Now remember in Daniel chapter 7, it mentioned that there were 1,000 and 10,000 times 10,000 standing before him. When this judgment is made, Jesus Christ will send forth his angels, and what do? They will collect out from his kingdom all things that cause stumbling and persons who are doing lawlessness or injustices. And so in this scripture, it's describing that same kind of lawlessness that we read about in Micah chapter 3. Those metaphors used to describe the teeth and the claws of the wild beast, the tearing of skin. And notice that these are collected out from his kingdom. What is Jesus Christ's kingdom? Christianity. These are collected out from Christianity. And are they annihilated, totally annihilated, as described in Daniel chapter 7? Well, yes, those are similar words that Jesus Christ used. He says, "And they will pitch them into the fiery furnace," totally annihilated. There is where their weeping and the gnashing of their teeth will be. And so it's describing the end result to those heads of Jacob, the 10 kings of the wild beast,
who will be weeping and gnashing their teeth. And so to further understand that this is a conflict inside the kingdom between heads of Jacob, 10 kings, and the remaining 2 kings who are of the 12 tribes of Israel, because if there's 10 unrighteous kings, that leaves 2 who must be righteous. And it mentions here, at that time the righteous ones will shine as brightly as the sun in the kingdom of their Father. And so those other 2 heads of Jacob will not be in the kingdom. They will not possess that kingdom until this occurs. Once Jesus Christ sends forth those angels at the conclusion of the system of things, those other heads of Jacob, the 2 remaining heads of Jacob, will be in the kingdom. They will possess the kingdom of their Father. Let him that has ears listen. Now also notice that it describes the weeping and gnashing of their teeth. And so in regards to these 10 leaders of the tribes of Israel, their inheritance will be taken away. They had a most amazing opportunity to rule as kings with Jesus Christ forever. And so by being pitched into the fiery furnace, they lose that opportunity. And hopefully you can understand why there would be weeping and gnashing of teeth once that occurs. Now, understanding this, we can go back to something else Jesus Christ said in the book of Matthew, in Matthew chapter 24. So we'll go to 24, and we'll see a circumstance which also describes weeping and gnashing of teeth in Matthew chapter 24, and in verse 48. And notice it differentiates between a faithful and discreet slave, but also an evil slave. And it says in verse 48, but if ever that evil slave should say in his heart, my master is delaying. And so this evil slave has a master, Jesus Christ. So these are indeed called anointed ones, the evil slave. And in my opinion, if you've made all those profound connections back to Micah chapter 3, this evil slave are those heads of Jacob, the unrighteous heads of Jacob, who treat God's people as if they were a wild beast, tearing their skin and crushing and devouring. And notice it says, and should start to beat his fellow slaves. So these fellow slaves would be the faithful and discreet slave, beaten by the evil slave. They all have Jesus Christ as their master. And so understand that this is an internal conflict to Jesus Christ's kingdom through called anointed ones. And it says the master of that slave will come on a day that he does not expect, and in an hour he does not know, and will punish him with the greatest severity, and will assign him his part with the hypocrites. Certainly if these heads of Jacob were the ones who were supposed to understand justice and yet did not, they treated God's people with impunity, then they are hypocrites. And the parallel to Matthew chapter 13, it says, there is where his weeping and the gnashing of his teeth will be. So hopefully you see these connections throughout the scriptures to the wild beast in Daniel chapter 7, the heads of Jacob, the 12 tribes of Israel, the 10 kings who are not righteous, leaving 2 kings who must indeed be righteous. Now that brings us to another question about these 2 kings, the remaining 2 of the 12 leaders of the tribes of Israel, who must be righteous. And if we go back to the book of Revelation, can we find anywhere in the book of Revelation where it mentions two who are indeed doing what Jesus Christ actually wanted them to do? If we go to Revelation chapter 11, we can indeed. And notice it says here, after measuring the temple, the sanctuary of God, and the altar, and those worshiping in it. So the Jesus Christ's kingdom is being measured here. It says, I will cause my two witnesses to prophesy 1,260 days dressed in sackcloth. These are symbolized by the two olive trees and the two lampstands, and are standing before the Lord of the earth. In my opinion, these two are the remaining two heads of Jacob who are found standing before the Lord of the earth during the final part of the days. The other 10 are the unrighteous heads of Jacob who are dealing in a bad way with God's people through extraordinary injustices as described in Micah chapter 3. Now back to Micah chapter 3, and we'll take a look again at the scripture which uses those nouns and adjectives which are so profoundly similar to the wild beast in Daniel chapter 7. And once again, I'd like to bring to your attention that it's addressing the heads of Jacob, the commanders of the house of Israel. And that it's because of these head ones of the house of Jacob, the ones that detest justice, and who are in fact building Zion or Jerusalem, it's because of these men that Jerusalem is desolated and Zion is plowed up. So we can see this judgment against the heads of Jacob. So if you understand what's happening to the heads of Jacob, now I'd like to move back to Micah chapter 2 and show you an anomaly where it appears that Jacob is being blessed. So here we see Jacob, the heads of Jacob being condemned. And if we step back now to Micah chapter 2, to what it says immediately before chapter 3, and we'll notice it's still in regard to the house of Jacob and to those who are scheming what is harmful and practicing what is bad. So this is about the house of Jacob. Now he's also saying that his own people rise up as an outright enemy. And yet, notice here, right at the end of Micah chapter 2, before it gets into that scripture that profoundly resembles the wild beast in Daniel chapter 7, notice what it says. I shall positively gather Jacob, all of you. I shall without fail collect the remaining ones of Israel together. In unity I shall set them, like a flock in the pen, like a drove in the midst of its pasture. They will be noisy with men. So this is a very interesting situation where it appears that Jacob is being condemned, and yet here we have what appears to be a blessing with Jacob being gathered together. Now, where is Jacob gathered from? Because they are like a flock in the pen. So if they're brought into a pen, and these are simply the remaining ones of Israel, then what happened with the majority of Israel and Jacob? Certainly then, I think you would have to agree that if this is what happens to the remaining ones of Jacob, then Micah chapter 3, this is what happens to the significant part of Jacob. In other words, these are not the remaining ones of Jacob who are being condemned because of their lack of justice and their haters of what is good and lovers of badness. And so now back to chapter 2. This remnant is being gathered together, and yet they are still out of Jacob, suggesting that there are some remaining holy ones who are collected out of that situation, away from the wild beast that's described in Micah chapter 3, and so very similar to the wild beast in Daniel chapter 7. Now, where do these come from? If they're being gathered, where are they being gathered from? Well, notice in the next verse 13. The one making a breakthrough will certainly come up before them. Before who? Before the remnant of Jacob. They will actually break through, and they will pass through a gate, and they will go out by it. Now, certainly if there is a remnant going out through a gate, then they're leaving the city. They are getting out of that kingdom, the wild beast, the end-time wild beast in Revelation chapter 17, Micah chapter 3, and Daniel chapter 7. And it says here, their king will pass through before them. Well, who's the king? Jesus Christ, with Jehovah at the head of them. God. So now, this makes a profound statement in regard to what actually happens during the end times before that wild beast is desolated, annihilated, before it's plowed up. There are remaining ones who are gathered out of the city. They pass through a gate and they go out by it. And yet they're still called Jacob. So please understand that this Jacob must be the remnant or the two leaders of the 12 tribes of Israel who are not compromising justice like the other 10 kings of the wild beast and their tribes. So my suspicion is that these are the two witnesses in the book of Revelation and their tribes, the ones who follow the leaders of these two tribes of Jacob, two sons of Jacob, who are leaders of the tribes and remain standing before the Lord. Now, notice that they are following their king out of the city. And I'd like to now take you to Hebrews in the New Testament, Hebrews chapter 13, and we'll go to verse 13 and notice what the Apostle Paul says, which is very similar to that verse in Micah chapter 2 and verse 13. It says here, let us then go forth to him, to Jesus Christ, outside the camp, bearing the reproach he bore, for we do not have a city here that continues, but we are earnestly seeking the one to come. So here we have a situation where Jesus Christ is going outside, through the gate, out through the gate, out of the city. And to remind you again, in Micah chapter 2, these ones are following their king, who passes through before them, out through a gate and going out by it. Notice the similarities to Hebrews chapter 13. And their king will pass through before them. So this, I believe, explains the situation immediately before Jesus Christ returns and prior to the mountain of the house of Jehovah becoming firmly established above the top of the mountains. The men of Zion, the heads of Jacob, will be plowed up as a mere field, and Jerusalem herself will become a mere heap of ruins. In my opinion, it's very important for a Christian to understand what's happening in the final part of the days to Christianity. And I believe these scriptures help us to see the predicament. And that being out of the gate, out of the kingdom, outside of the camp, would be a recommended thing to do, to remove oneself from that circumstance where Zion will be plowed up as a mere field and Jerusalem will become a heap of ruins. A Christian would not want to be inside this city when it is annihilated and desolated. Think very carefully about these things. Now, at the start of the video, I mentioned that I was making this video to support another video series I did on the book of Revelation, which has a lot more content about the kings who you will find mentioned throughout the entire book of Revelation. For instance, if we go back to chapter 16 in the book of Revelation, we see kings mentioned once again. That there are expressions inspired by demons that perform signs, and they go forth to kings of the entire inhabited earth. Once again, these are not pagan kings. And so I invite you to watch that video series, which you can find in my channel, on the book of Revelation, that speaks more to who these kings are. And it's my hope you'll appreciate that the book of Revelation is written specifically for these kind of people, the kings, the leaders of the tribes of Israel. And this warning is in print all around the world in every single Bible for these kings to recognize the situation that occurs immediately before the conclusion of the system of things, immediately before the return of Jesus Christ. And so if that connection can be made, you will be a Christian who understands the situation, the terrible predicament that Christianity is in. And so if you want to see that video series on the book of Revelation, I invite you to go to my YouTube channel. It's Isaiah 30v8. And you can scroll down through my videos and find that series on the book of Revelation. And there's 6 parts. And this video series supports the video you are presently watching with a lot more detail. Now also I mentioned the 2 witnesses in the book of Revelation in chapter 11. And if we go back to chapter 11, I made the suggestion that these 2 witnesses who are standing before the Lord of the earth are the other 2 heads of Jacob who aren't compromised through their injustices, and they are in fact standing before the Lord of the earth and dressed in sackcloth, and these are the same two witnesses. So if you go once again to my YouTube channel, you should find a video where I speak a lot more in detail about the situation with the two witnesses in the book of Revelation. So I invite you to do that. Also, you could go to my blog. Okay, I'm making a video, and in my blog, which you can reach through that link in my YouTube channel, you have an opportunity to get either a hard copy of a book through this link, or you could read the same book through a Scribd link, which you'll find at the bottom of the sidebar on my blog. If you click on the Scribd link right here, it will take you to a place where you can download and freely read the book I've written. In that book, I actually mentioned the 10 kings by name. And to reach the point where you are willing to accept that that is indeed the names of the 10 kings, you will have to read all the supporting material in the book. So I invite you to do that. And so with that said, I hope that many of the popular convictions that you'll find regarding the book of Revelation and the wild beast and the 10 kings are now overturned, and that you will rethink and reread that book of Revelation from a completely different point of view. So thank you for persevering through this video, and watch for a new video that I hope to make soon regarding the 7 heads of the wild beast, where I will once again show that the 7 heads are related entirely to Jesus Christ's kingdom and have nothing to do with a pagan or secular authorities. So please subscribe to my channel, and you'll get an update when I'm able to finish that video. Thank you very much for persevering through my long-winded explanations.